Section 9, traction motor. The general operation limits the maximum 600 volts, 600 amperes, 650 RPMs, 265. The number of the brush arms 4. The brushes per arms 2. The size of the brush is 3/4 of an inch by 1/4 of an inch. 2. The brush pound. The full length of the brush is 79 inches. Normal pole bear boards. The center poles inches. The main poles is 16 and 375 thousandths of an inch, or thousandths of an inch. Communicating pole 16 and 375 thousandths of an inch. Weight pounds of the motor with the gear and the casing of the 3,210 and armature completion of the 760. Resistant windings at the arms of 25 degrees Celsius. Armature is 0 are 188 10,000 of an inch. Communicating fields is 0 60 6 10,000 or thousandths of an inch. Shears fielding is at 126 10,000 of an inch. Armature bearings pinion end of the 85 millimeter roller. A communicator end of the 60 millimeter ball. Axles bearing type of the sleeve. Oil level inches the height of the oil and the axle bearings are measured from the bottom of the chamber from the use of the flexible should be followed to the maximum 375 thousandths of an inch, minimum of 1 in 125 thousandths of an inch. Many application of the teeth are 13 and 15, and application temperature Celsius. Shaft temperature of 32 above to 132 plus and 136 plus. Shaft temperature in Celsius. Advanced limits of the maximum inches of 0 48 thousandths is 49 thousandths of an inch. Minimum inches of 0 40 thousandths of an inch to 39 thousandths of an inch. 79 description. The motors are designed to give the specified performance operating in all parallel, give the best condition with regard to the wood hole slippage, high tractive effort to the traction motor is the same type of the generally used electronic traction, commonly called the axle bearing direct current series motor. It is designated the direct current because the current operates the flows continuously in one direction. It designates the series because the operation of the current operates the flows continuously. The windings in series, the first one of the through, then through the other. One side of the motor is supported by the bearings, locomotive axle. Other side of the suspension noise of the cast of the motor is supported by the truck frame cross tie. Each motor is connected by the axle through the single set of the gears. 80. The axle bearings, the clearance of the wears, the near axle bearings of the board at 2,000 2/100ths of an inch to 22,000 of an inch larger than the axle bear over the center of the portion of the 300ths of the 32,000ths of an inch larger than the axle near the ends of the give the relief board. The axle bearing seats of the motor boarded to the size of the 16,000ths of an inch to 17,000ths of an inch shim between the caps of the frames in order to give the clamping fit. When the axle bearing is not serious as the wear as the armature bearing, the renewal of the axle bearing will show the wear of 8/8 of an inch to 3/16 of an inch. Maximum amount of clearance can be measured in the insert of the narrow filler gauge between the underside of the axle and the bearing of the gauge may be done through the windows provided for the purpose of axle shielding. The end of the wear must not be allowed to exceed the maximum 1/4 of an inch. Commutator bearing of the north 332 of an inch gear the case the bearing. 81. Removing and replacing the axle bearing. In the case of the bearing, it becomes necessary to remove the axle bearing with the motor is on the axle. Proceed as follows. Run the locomotive over the pit. One is available. If not, locate the best advantage of the working underside of the axle. If the bearing being removed is gear sided, necessary to take out the gear case of the bolts dropped off of the gear case. Take off the, for example, axle's bearing caps of remove the cap and if the cap sticks. Here is another picture of the traction motor outline. It shows as the air inlet and the air leads extends to 96 inches over the frame of the bore diameter at 1600 of an inches of one. You have your gauge, your feeler gauge, and the center armature. Also with lower lug. Over here, there's a traction motor outline. This shows the between the wheel and the gauge and the meter at 39 and 3/8 of an inch. Also the flanges and the closed fit pinion only traction motor outline. It can be loosened by tightening a flat hold of the chisel to crack between the cap of the motor frame, first on the one side of the other. Care should be taken to see that the caps properly supported the helper back toward blocking when the back being loosened in order to prevent the dropping suddenly, causing the personal injury. The lower half of the axle bearing drop down the cap and readily knocks out the wooden block of the hammer to remove the upper half of the bearing. Jack up the motor and frame in sufficient amount to relieve the weight of the bearing and remove the upper half of the axle until the cap is slipped off below. If the bearing sticks in the frame, it cannot be knocked loose by the driving down of the flange of the arm hammer with the wooden block. When the new bearings are installed, they intern the shims of the 14,000th of an inch between the axle cap of the motor frame, driving the axle straight, rotor rocking, distorting the splines, and the pinching of the bearings. The minimum radial clearance between the axle and the bearing should be at least 10/100ths of an inch. The assembly shims do not be removed unless the bearing shell became loose surface and necessary to restore the clamping action between the bearing seals and the axle bearings. It's at the same time desirable to either their thinner assembly shims or no shims as may be detected by the crush may be necessary to control bearing clearance without bearing shell distortion. See that the new bearing is perfectly clean and rub all little oil over the surface before the putting it in its place. Repack the cleaning of the new waste, fill all the oil well at the proper level. Refer to the paragraphs 37 through the 44. The strapping holding motor nose should not be applied in such manner that reproduce the clamping axle surface. Stresses the nose, the axle bearings may be result at least in currents of one each side of the nose necessary to allow the wearing truck of the part. 82. The hot axle bearings. The hot axle bearings will occur occasionally and are usually result in one of the following cases: lack of the oil bearings and imperfectly packed bearings. New bearings will insufficient clearance, foreign substances working in the bearing, motor noise, clamps, excessive playing in the truck axles. In case of investigating one to the level oil well, make sure that it is up to the amount of the specified oil well. In general, the data paragraph 78 examines the waste and packaging, sure that them may be falling through the shaft and not in the proper shape. The repacking, the accordance with the instruction of the lubrication of the paragraph 39. In case of a new axle bearing as well, examine the clearance of the bearing is too tightly set up for the frequently case of the trouble. If trouble persists with the bearing freshly packed, the oil the right level and ample clearance is removed the bearing and examine it. If the bearing shows the cutting of the carefully scraped down to the new surface to the badly scored, replacing the new bearing. Before replacing the bearing which has been cutting, the examiner journal carefully remove any of the roughness emery paper taking care of the operation removal trail. All traces of the grit of the clean rag of the rub over the journal with oil. Do not grease only the journal with lubricated oil. Waste is grease was glazed the waste surfaces, preventing the oil from reaching the bearing. 83. The brush holder and brushes. The brush holder and brushes can be inspected removing the commutator cover. Under no circumstances should the carbon brush is be permitted wear down so that the further brush finger bears on the carbon box. Replacing any brushes which may wear the sufficient extent of the finger will be less than 1/8 of an inch in the end of its travel before the next extension. The brush thickness is very important, and clearance of the new brushes of the holder should be approximately 4 to 10,000ths of an inch or 10/100ths of an inch, and clearance much less than minimum. The carbon will tend to stick on the box and greater than 25,000ths of an inch of the inch. Brush may rattle wear away the slides, the chip of the brake, or the width of the brush is not important. It may have as much as 1/2 in clearance of the box without causing any trouble. Brushes pressure on the commutator maintained by the means of the clock-type springs, which exert the pressure of the fingers, which resist on the top of the brushes. The brush pressure, the measure of the attaching the small spring balance of the pressure of the finger directly over the brushing, pulling straight up the line of the brush traveler. The finger just lifted in the clear of the brush. The pressure of the brush is to be checked at all the manner. Brush holder in the place of the motor. The brush pressure given the general data in paragraph 78 of the new brush. The thrust of the brush holder, which could not exceed the reach spring balance and be checked at the comparing of the field of those brush holder springs in the field, so checked on the balance. To remove the brush holder, the renew accurate adjustment of the brush pressure of the first disconnection cable. The holder, the removing the tab of the bolt. When supporting the clamp is loosened, the holder may be lifted to adjusting spring pressure. Insert of the piece of 1/8 of an inch diameter drill rod of the holder. Tension of the barrel, the spring requiring adjustment, relieving the tension of the cotter pin. Remove the cotter pin, increase the tension required with the rotation tension bar that is made. Replace the cotter pin. Keep the underside of the brush holder carbon in which not less than 1/8 of an inch of the commutator reduces the chance of the brush breakdown. A adjustment can be adjusted, loosening, clamping the black bolt, removing the brush holder to the current position. A fiber sheet of the proper thickness of the handy gauge. 84. The commutator. The commutator, when taken in the polish, shows that no signs of the wear, does not require any attention. The commutator is roughly badly worn, burned, removed, or placed in the lathe, which should turn and grind a stone to give uniform surface. As far as mica might be regrooved with special saws. The mica installation because between the copper and the segments grooved in the undercut of the initial depth of the 3/64 of an inch of the commutator wears of its turn in the ground, maintaining the groove, since the high mica will spill out the brush, causing the sparking. Uncutting can be done by the best advantage of the use of the small power driven saws as the purpose of after the commuter has turned the undercut to remove the burrs that always formed on the edges during the process of corner cutting tool round the end of the communicator ends, cleaning the slots and finishing the polishes. Is in the fine sandpaper, the blowing off the compressed air lift brushes, smushing the commutator. The machine does not place until the gray is removed. Never emery cloth of 0-1 emery paper on a commutator. Never use emery cloth of 0-1 emery paper on a communicator. Do not use a lubricating communicator. There is sufficient amount of the graphite in the brush to supply the lubrication required. Dismantling and assembling motors. Special tools required for the dismantling of the traction motor are shown in the figure 7 and should be supplied with a set of the special tools which may be made for the drawings supplied. The removal of the traction motor for the locomotive. Remove the tape of the motor lead and the connectors. Disconnect all the motor connectors. Take off the cares to see that all the leads are plainly marked so that they will have no trouble being reconnected. Remove the truck center pin and disconnect the brake and the sander and other connections between the truck and the cab. Jack the cab at one end of the sufficient amount to clear the run of the truck under the frame. Truck out of from under it. Remove the gear case, unbolting the two halves, removing the bolts holding the gear case to the motor. Remove the motor axle cap bolts of and take off the axle cap. If the cap sticks, if the can be loosened, tighten the flatten the chisel in the crack between the cap and the motor, and listen first one side of the end and then the other. Careful should be taken to see that the cap is properly supported. The helper, the backed up blocking when the ends broken, being loosened in order to prevent dropping suddenly, causing personal injury. Removal of the straps which hold the motor nose in place of the truck, ransom or block up the motor near the link of the suspension rod, and knocking out of the pin. Lifting the motor out of the truck and crane of the holding, lifting the chains of the bale, casting the motor frame, and the purpose when the hook and the crane chains, the three chains that are employed carrying should be taken to adjust the length of the land motor of the left first on the side next to the truck center that is rotated around the axle the sufficient amount so the lower lip of the axle bearing housing the clear of the axle before the chain attached for the axle side of the motor takes up the slack. Removal of the traction motor pinions. Pinions are most easily removed means of the pinion puller, especially to the pinion of desired. Simple one of the puller will meet the requirements may be made. The special tool drawing in figure 17, the puller should be applied to the showing on the tool drawing fully equipped with the service shop. A power puller may be available and can be used if adaptable. Care should be exercised when removing the motor pinions, taking the following precautions. Do not try to remove the set of the pinion driving the wedge between the pinion and motor housing oil or thrower, considering damage will result in the motor. In order to prevent damage from anti-friction bearings, avoid all blows with a sledgehammer on the pinion or the pinion puller. Never apply to the flame to any of the pinion that is put back in the service, as there is greater danger of destroying original heat treatment. And removing a worn pinion that is scraped or very hard to pull off, it may be necessary to apply the heat with a torch, expand the pinion, and relieve it from the fit. When an old pinion is heated, the great care must be taken to protect the shaft and housings to prevent the having being damaged by the heat. Applying the traction motor pinions. The following instructions cover the method of using applying the pinions to the traction motor shaft and being tapered to fit. The primary precautions: check the seat of the shaft, the pinion board, remove all burrs and enlargement of the gouge spots. Check the pinion fitted on the shaft of the Persian blue scraped stone of the pinion board of at least 75% of the area on the contact of the blue best way to check the fit of the blue to the shaft: place the pinion on the shaft about 1 inch from the final position, then give the quick shove home. The pinion can be removed lightly, driving a metal wedge between the pinion face and the oil thrower of the motor housing. They should be done pinions applied to the cold shaft. For the pinions of the keyway, for pinions with a keyway, the key should be tightly fit the keyway of the shaft. The keyway of the pinion may be 10,000th of an inch larger, but not smaller than the key. The clearance between the top of the key and the bottom of the keyway and the pinion must be at least 1/64th of an inch. Round over the corners of the key to prevent the cutting of the fillet over the keyway. Round corners of the lead of the keyway, round corners of the key way to prevent gouging. To try to the cold pinion of the shafting, make sure the key will not bind to prevent the pinion of the moving into proper position. 2. The cold standoff. The clean shaft is pinion brought thoroughly the benzoyl solvent to remove all traces of oil. Prussian blue with the pinion of the shaft aiming temperature, placing the pinion of the shaft above 1 inch of the final position of the given. Give a quick shove of the home. Measure the distance pinion of the standing off the end of the shaft. Micrometer depth gauge. Mark at the point of the measure and mark across the end of the shaft. The heating of the pinion can be mounted exactly. This goes on for another couple pages. We'll stop when I get to page, I guess 50. We'll get to page 50 and I'll stop. We go over the cold standoff. Clean the shaft pinion bore thoroughly with the benzoyl solvent to remove all traces of the oil and the Prussian blue with the pinion to shaft at the same temperature. Place the pinion on the shaft about 1 inch from the final position. Give the quick shove of the home. Measure the distance pinion. Stand off the end of the shaft. Micrometer depth gauge. Make the measurement. Make across the shaft so that heating of the pinion is mounted exactly. Same angular position of the shaft. Measurements made by the same points. Remove the pinion of the shaft. Lightly driven the wedge between the pinion face of the oil thrower and the multi-bracket. The heating pinions uniformly for the sufficient length of time, soaking thoroughly. Heating the pinion at 10 degrees Celsius above the application of the given the motor general data. In paragraph 78, this allows sufficient time to remove the pinions from the heating sources to clean the bores, checking the temperature before applying the approved methods for the heating pinions in order to preference are given the induction heater, election oven, gas oven, and oil only as a last resort. If the oven facilities are not available, electrical roaster will work satisfactorily on all pinions upon an outside diameter of 12 inches. Pinions must not never be heated above 200 degrees Celsius. If oil is used to heat the pinions, they must be thoroughly cleaned with benzoyl dry rags to remove all traces of oil from the pinion board before applying to the shaft. Application: remove the pinion from the heating source of the place near the shaft which is applied, cleaning the shaft with the pinions very clean with the dry rags to remove all the traces of the oil. To check pinion temperatures when the electro pyrometer placed as close as the pinion bore is assembly. As soon as the pinion temperature comes down to the prescribed application temperature, the pinion should be applied on the shaft exactly the same angular position in the same manner in the cold standoff. The same mechanic who applied the pinion pinion cold should apply the pinion hot in order to obtain the same force and push and measure to the hot standoff of the pinion. And from the end of the shaft in the same manner, the same position of the cold standoff was taken. The difference between the hot and cold standoff gives the advantage to the pinion of the shaft. This advance must be followed with the application limits. The application temperature given in the paragraph 78 is estimated only to may have the adjustment experience to maintain advance of the proper limits. If the advance is not within proper limits, the pinion must be pulled and reapplied. Fastening. 5. Fastening. The pinion equipped with the nut applied the lock washer nut as soon as the hot advances is taken. The screw pointing to that nut homely and tightly with the wrench, having purchased leverage of 4 to 6 feet. Removal of the armature from the motor. If it is necessary to remove the armature from the motor, the following procedure will be allowed. Taking out the pinion nut to provide the nuts and lifting the armature, pulling the pinion of the pinion end of the bearing is to the dismantled removal of the traction motor pinions. See above. Remove the title of the communicator cover and lift the far enough out of the brush box so that they will not slide back against the communicator. Protect the communicator, wrapping the heater heavy with fish paper. Remove the bolt holding from the bearing cartridge, the housing of the communicator, loosening the communicator end to the end of the motor. Turn the motor so that the shaft is at the true vertical position and the pinion end is supporting the motor on the blocks, avoiding the damage and communicator end of the cap. Remove the bolts holding the pinion to the end the housing of the frame. Insert the 3/4 inch bolts and 3 tab holes equally spaced around the housing. Tighten up these holes and the housing out of the frame of the fit. Screw the special lifting nuts of the pinion end of the shaft and the lifting armature out of the frame of the both bearing assembly intact. Remove the armature bearing. The armature may be clamped the wooden saddle of the horizontal. Position: it may be placed on a bench at the wedge at the side of the stability. Remove the commuter end of the bearing. The commuter ending the ball bearing is pulled off as shown in the procedure as follows. Remove the bearing. Remove the bolt of the which holding the outside of the bearing cap of the bearing outrigger. Remove the cap. Remove the two screws in the bearing lock nut. Remove the lock nut using the special wrench. Remove the bearing cartridge bearing thoroughly applying the puller shown in the tool drawing when wrap the bearing and greasing, throwing the protective cover, lubing the greasing in the bearing grease in the bearing. The grease of the bearing will serve the preventing the rusting of the bearing. Must be cleaned and inspected before reassembling the housing. Reassemble the pinion ending bearing. The pinion ending bearing roll is removed and should be shown on the tool drawing. The figure 17. The procedure as follows: remove the outer bearing stop of the user pole as shown in the figure 17. Remove the outer bearing cap. Remove the housing bearing out of the race of the roller assembly. Remove the outer basing of the race of the housing, the tap of the housing, the rawhide mallet, the slip of the bearing bow off to the tight of this housing. The removed in the above manner the bearing can be tapped out by using a brass bar on the outer race. Most of the work required on the armature can be done either in an inner race and in place. Make sure that they thoroughly clean the race thoroughly and cap before assembly. In the inner race of the cap may be pulled when necessary using the puller shown in the tool drawing figure 17. G. The inner brace of the bearing wrap the protective covering, leaving the grease of the bearing in the grease of the bearing will serve the preventing of the rust, and the bearing must be cleaned and inspected before the reassembly. Cleaning and inspection of the armature bearing. Cleaning the bearings and gasoline also means of dry compressed air. The final cleaning will be cleaning the gasoline after which the bearings will be blown off with dry compressed air. How holding the cage, the inner racing, the rotating the outer race of the directing compressed air around the roller bearings cage of the races. The next holder, the outer race of the rotate the cage of the inner race. If the bearing is not reassembled, immediately grease wrap in the protective covering to keep the dirt out of the moisture. In holding the bearings during overall cleanly, inletless close, keeping the both hands and bearings clean. Or do not use the waste of the bearings before reassembling the bearings. Carefully inspect the cracked races or cages, cracked and pitted roller or balls, excessive wears or cages or races, or loosened cage rivets. H. Heating bearings, oil, and for assembly. The oil container heating of the bearings details mostly refrigerated support approximately 2 inches above the bottom will allow any of the dirt drop of the bearings and aim to prevent the heat from shrinking into the bearings. The container must be kept clean in the high temperature oil such as compressor oil. Assembly disassemble if any of the reason being inner outer race does not pull readily is if it does not use the flame the bearing instead of the pour the hot over the inner race of the loosening cartridges, expanding them and ease of the fit of the permit pulling. Removal or replacing the field coils. In case of one of the field coils has to be removed, proceed as follows. Assuming the motor frames has been dismounted in the armature, remove the strip of the insulation of the connection of the lead between the coils to be removed. The adjacent coils solder the connections by using the blowtorch. Take care of protect the coil from the flames by pieces of asbestos sheets. Here you see on the commutator end of the bearing puller, the pinion end of the ball puller. So pinion end of the puller. See and the grease throw puller and the pinion puller. Once again, back to the removal or replacing the field coils. Do not remove the tap of the bolts with both pieces of the coils with itches. Lift off the peep when remove the coil. When replacing, the procedure should be reversed and described. The following points should be carefully noted. It is important that the main coil spring and the wide main coil washer may be placed between the pole tip of the coil, the washer between the coil and the coil spring. Be sure to place the communicating coil spring in the tie and the wide communicating coil washer back to the communicating coil before putting in place. Take care these items do not split between the people they seat. Take care that the items do not split between the pole and seat between the bolted of the frame. The tiled narrow communicating coil washer should be placed between the pole tip of the coil. C. Make sure that the coil is turned to the right side of the right end with the placing in the position. Check for the proper polarity according to the field of the diagram. Do you see that the pole seat back from the back are clean and free from chips before putting the edge of the pole in the place, making sure that the pole is pulled home into the seat of the tap bolts. D. E. Measure the final pole bore, the center of the face of the pole the bearings replaced by the pole diametrically opposite of the check of the normal pole bearer. Valves gives on general data. Paragraph 78. Assemble the communicator end of the ball bearing. Refer to the bearing assembly as the guide of the proper assembly. 1. Place the proper place armature, preferably in the vertical position, a hole little larger than the armature diameter cut into the low wooden tabled benches together with some of the wooden wedges to keep the armature from dropping through the serves very well. Clean all parts of the turret before starting to assemble carefully. Inspect the bearings for cracks, pitting, and excess wear. Caution: care must be also taken to keep all dirt and grit from away from the bearings. Place the bearing cartridge, grease that thrower, the high temperature oil, the temperature 100 degrees Celsius, 200 degrees, 15 degrees, 212 degrees Fahrenheit using the compressor oil. Remove the bearing cartridge from the hot oil to wipe off the excessive oil, dropping into place with over the shaft. Remove the grease thrower to the hot of the oil to wipe off the excessive oil. Shrink the water in the chamfer. Shrink on the shaft of the chamfer side of the hold and place it solidly against the shoulder on the shaft until it is clogged. Pack the lower half of this grease pocket into the bearing cartridge to hold the grease as specified. Move the bearing from the hot oil, wipe off the inner and outer fittings, immediately drop into place the cartridge bore expanded. Do not force the assembly of the bearing must be in place, holding the bearing solidly placed against the grease thrower until the tightly. Apply the bearing lock nut, tightening the set screws, striking the bearing nut with a hammer, again tightening the set screws, being pinned into the nut to lock the set screws. Fill the spaces between the balls of the grease to fill the grease pocket with the outer bearings, the cap of the half of the grease bolt, the cap of the increase, and its gasket to the place of the bearing cartridge. Some of the portion of the grease is bearing of the cap must be contacted with the bearing assembly channel. I'll make sure that the grease fitting is not in damage. Assembly of the pinion and end armature roller and bearing. Place the armature vertical position, hole in little larger the armature diameter cut in the low wooden table of the bench, but together with some of the wooden wedges to keep the armature from dropping thoroughly through. Serves very well. Clean all parts of it thoroughly before starting the assembly. Carefully inspect it. The bearings of the cracked pitting and the excessive wear. This is a traction motor wiregram. Once again, north pole, south pole, compatible shaft through the polarity. Coils laid on the bench after assembling in the frame. Use of the resistor of the circuit, which in the coils give enough direction current flowing as shown in the arrows big air below the polarity. Caution: care must also be taken when keeping all dirt and grit away from the roller bearings. Place the greaser thrower, inner bearing racer, high temperature oil at 100 degrees Celsius, 215 degrees Fahrenheit. Use the compressor oil to place the inner bearing cap over the shaft. Remove the grease thrower from the hot of the oil to wipe off the excessive shrink of the shaft. Chamfer off the hold in place solidly against the shoulder on one shaft of the bulking up the told until it is cooled. And this is a picture of a traction motor armature bearing assembly. Over here you have the fitting must be not expanded beyond the diameter. Minimum bearing clearances. You have pinion end from the pinion end and the housing. This is right here. Motor's armature shaft. This is right here. 3, the bearing cap. Okay, you got your bearing cap piston end of the gasket bearing cap at the PEM. Let me see if I can shoot out on this. Okay, 4, the grease gasket of the bearing cap of the PE inner, the 5A back bearing cap of the position end outer, the gasket of the bearing cap of the PE outer, the grease of the thrower, the pinion end of the bearing stop, and the free bullet roll bearing, the hex head of the steel bolt, the 1/2 inch standard steel lock washer communicator ending housing the bearing cartridge communicator end of the bearing cap of the communicator end of the outer, and the gasket of the bearing cap of the communicator end of the 1/2 inch 13 by 1.5 inch hex head steel bolt, the 5/16 of an inch by 1 hex steel bolt, the 5/16 of standard steel lock washer, grease throttles and communicator ends of the 60 millimeter free fall ball bearing fit, barrel bearing, see general data, bearing nut, the 5/16 of an inch, 1/2 inch cup point set at screw, the 1/8 of an inch grease plug, the grease and nameplate, the bearing grease, the general data, sealing grease, the gear case, the two hex sealed at 1/8 of an inch, 2.5 inch hex seals bolt, 1/8 of an inch, 1/8 by 3.25 inch hex seals steel bolt, 1 inch standard stock washer pinion nut, and 2 inches of standard stock steel lock washer with the pinion key. Okay, Remove the inner race of the hot oil to wipe off the excessive oil applied to the shaft using the buckling up the tool as before. Using the space between the rollers, bearings, and the grease chamber, the caps of the one half of the grease is specified in Figure 5. The tightening the bearing of the place in the housing using the outer bearing to determine the approximate location. Sliding the housing out of the race of the roller, assembly placing the before carefully score inner race of the rollers, checking the internal radial clearance of the bearing of the bearing assembly of the drawing, the proper clearance, applying the outer bearing of the draw cap in the bolt in place, heating the outer bearing stop of the oven at a temperature at 150 degrees Celsius. Slide it in place and shown in the bearing assembly as it cools. Tap the hammer into making sure the tight contact against the inner bearing race. The armature assembly into the frame. The armature assembly into the frame. It is important that the frame is placed so that it is truly vertical position. Otherwise, communicator end of the bearing cartridge with the hinging housing may be entered the respective fits of the cocked position. Wrapping a piece of fish paper or other protecting material around it. Communicator fits and secure the friction tape that serves to protect the commutator from the brush holders, dropping the armature of the place. The screw the two armatures, removal studs the communicator's cartridge to be used in the guiding of the lining of the holes in the cartridge using those in its frame, picking the armature using the special armature, lifting either lower in the frame of the blade, and being careful not to be secured to the armature of the commutator of the bearing to get the studs entered in the proper housing hole. Put the pinion end of the housing bolts in place. Remove the studs of the communicator cartridge is put in the proper position. They pull the communicator cartridge and it fits in the position of housing the fitting of the frame at the same site. Remove the protective part of the protective paper of the commutator armature of the hand. Make certain is free. Check for the proper clearance of 1/8 of an inch between the brush holders. Communicator lower the brushes and fits of the communicator using the medium grade sandpaper. Blow out the carbon dust of the dry compressed air. Replace the communicator covers. Miscellaneous control equipments.